The valley opened wide beneath the evening sky, painted in amber and fading indigo, the kind of vastness that made a man feel small even when he carried a rifle on his back. The land stretched like an old scar, dry and endless, whispering of promises broken and truces buried. Dust drifted with the wind, as if the earth itself sighed, remembering all it had seen. Those who lived upon it spoke less of the future and more of survival, for they knew the West devoured certainty. A lone rider crossed the land, his horse dark against the sinking sun. The cowboy leaned forward, hat low, shoulders heavy. His name mattered less than the silence he carried, a silence that had grown roots in him since loss carved its way through his life. Folks in the settlement called him steady, useful, a man of work. But they also said he kept to himself too much, that his words were rationed like water in drought. He built fences, drove cattle, kept peace with his neighbors, yet his heart remained closed like a locked cabin door. It was to him the council had turned when whispers of negotiation reached their ears. The tribe across the valley had sent word. Peace could be spoken, but only if they chose the messenger themselves. The settlers agreed, though some muttered it was a trick, that no Indian could be trusted with promises. Still, the cowboy was asked to meet them halfway, to stand as witness. He had little taste for politics, but something in the way the request was spoken made him mount his horse and ride into the golden dusk. When she arrived, she came alone, riding with her spine straight, her hair loose in the wind. The first thing seen was not her weapon, but her stillness. She did not flinch at the sight of the settlement, nor the watchful eyes that followed her. She rode as though the land belonged to her blood, and perhaps it did. She was called a warrior, chosen not for her skill alone, but for the way she bore herself, beauty and strength woven into one thread. Her cheek carried a scar, thin as a blade's kiss, but her gaze was steady, untamed, alive. The settlers stared. Some saw danger in the calm of her step. Some saw temptation. Others only saw a woman where they expected a man. Their doubts thickened the air. But the cowboy, watching her descend from her horse with slow precision, felt a strange hush within. She moved without apology, without explanation. When her eyes met his, there was no challenge, only acknowledgement, as though she had already seen through his silence and chosen not to break it. Talks began with caution, words placed like stones across a rushing river. She spoke for her people in a voice smooth as creek water, strong yet soft. The elders of the settlement asked for boundaries, for grazing rights, for promises of safety. She countered with reminders of treaties broken before, of rivers poisoned by cattle, of families buried beneath settler boots. Her beauty made the room restless, but her words gave it weight. The cowboy said little, his role more shadow than figure, but he listened. He noticed the way her hand brushed the earth before she sat, as though asking permission from the land itself. He noticed the pause in her breath when the settlers accused her of speaking with too much pride. Pride, he thought, was all she had left to carry. That night, fires burned low in camp. She sat apart, staring into the flames with the quiet of someone who knew how fleeting warmth could be. The cowboy found himself near her, though he had not planned to be. Silence stretched between them, but it was not heavy. It was like the pause before rain, waiting to be filled. He spoke first, voice rough from disuse. "You ride alone." Her eyes flickered to him, reflecting firelight. Alone is how truth travels. He nodded, understanding more than he expected. She asked nothing of him, offered no smile to ease the space. Yet he felt lighter, as though something had shifted. Days turned, negotiations dragging like slow cattle through mud. She remained patient, though frustration cracked the corners of her composure. At times she looked toward the hills, as if listening to voices carried on wind, perhaps ancestors, perhaps memories. The cowboy wondered if she doubted her task, if she felt the weight of being chosen not just as a warrior, but as a symbol. Rumors whispered through the settlement. Some said she was a trick, a lure for something darker waiting beyond the ridge. Others whispered she was too beautiful, that her presence weakened the resolve of men. One rancher spat that no treaty could be trusted when sealed by a woman's hand. But the older ones, those who had buried too many sons in nameless soil, muttered that maybe beauty was the only weapon left worth wielding. The cowboy kept listening. He caught glimpses of her strength in the smallest of gestures, the way she calmed her horse with a single breath, the way she met the children's eyes when others ignored them, the way she refused to lower her voice even when pressed by angry men. She was not here to charm, though her presence unsettled hearts. She was here to carve a space where none had been allowed. One evening, As dusk bruised the horizon, he found her kneeling by the river. Her hands rested on the water's surface, palms open. She whispered words he could not understand, but her tone held sorrow. He stepped close, careful not to disturb, but she turned her head slightly, acknowledging him. "You speak to them," he said softly. She nodded. "To those who came before. To remind them, I have not forgotten." The cowboy lowered his gaze. "I have forgotten too much," he admitted, though he did not say what. She studied him for a long breath, then returned her attention to the water, as though his confession belonged to the river now. The tension between their worlds grew tighter, like a rope pulled from both ends. Still, there were moments, shared glances, wordless understandings, that hinted at something gentler. Trust, fragile as new grass, began to sprout. Neither named it, neither reached for it, but it was there. Yet shadows gathered. The young settler boy who often ran messages to camp whispered of voices in the saloon, men angry that peace meant less land, fewer cattle. A tribal elder, his eyes clouded with years, warned her that not all of her people wished for talks to succeed. Both sides carried fire beneath their tongues. The cowboy sensed it too, the air shifting, as if the land itself braced for storm. He found himself watching her more closely, not out of suspicion, but out of a strange, unspoken duty. When she moved, he noted the set of her shoulders. When she spoke, he weighed the patience behind her words. Something in him, long dormant, stirred like an old fire catching wind. On the final night of the first round of talks, the sky was streaked with silver. They sat apart from the others, her gaze lifted to the stars. He asked her then, "What do you see?" She did not look at him, only answered, "I see a path the world refuses to walk, and if it never does." Her voice softened, almost breaking. "Then I walk it alone." The cowboy felt the weight of her words settle into him. For a moment, he wanted to tell her she would not have to. But silence pressed his tongue, and the moment passed. The fire cracked low, shadows stretching. Around them, men muttered, suspicious eyes watching. The talks had not yet broken, but they teetered. Both sides waited for one misstep, one spark to turn the fragile thread into smoke. The cowboy leaned back, staring into the flames, knowing the road ahead was darker than what lay behind. Still, for the first time in years, he felt the faint stir of something worth guarding. Not land, not cattle, not even peace, but the quiet strength of a woman who carried truth like a torch into the dark. And though he did not yet know it, the ambush waiting on the horizon would demand he choose whether to protect that torch or let it die. Dawn rose slow and pale, washing the valley in a light too gentle for the weight it carried. The night's fires had died, leaving only smoke rising from ash, thin as ghost breath. The cowboy woke before the others, his hand resting on the rifle at his side, though he did not know why. Something in the stillness felt wrong, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The warrior was already awake, standing at the ridge with her hair loose against the morning wind. She did not turn as he approached, but he felt her awareness stretch toward him all the same. It was supposed to be the final day of words. The council would gather once more, test the edges of trust, and perhaps carve some small agreement. Yet the cowboy's chest carried a heaviness he could not name. He looked at her and thought of the path she claimed she would walk alone. He feared that path was nearer than either of them wished to admit. The meeting began with forced calm. Elders from both sides, seated on worn blankets and wooden chairs, voices measured, gestures precise. Promises and boundaries were spoken again, circling like hawks unwilling to land. The warrior held her ground, her voice a steady current, each phrase shaped by patience sharpened over years. The cowboy, as ever, stayed quiet, but his eyes moved constantly, scanning the faces, the shadows, the edges of the camp where unease gathered like thunderheads. Then the stillness broke. A crack split the air, gunfire, sharp and merciless. Dust leapt from the ground as men hidden beyond the ridge charged, rifles raised, mouths twisted by rage. They were not tribe nor settler, but those who thrived on division, outlaws who drank profit from chaos. The cowboy's heart lurched. He had not seen them coming. None of them had. The camp erupted. Shouts tangled with the scream of horses, with the tearing rush of bullets slicing air. The elders dove for cover, children pulled behind wagons, flames kicked high as lanterns toppled. The warrior rose in one fluid motion, blade drawn, her stance fierce against the chaos. She did not retreat. She became something more than a figure of negotiation. She was defiance itself, moving with grace born of fire and blood. The cowboy ran to her without thought. He fired once, twice, striking shadows in the dust. Men fell, others rose. He felt heat bite his arm, but did not falter. She met his glance only once, brief and sharp, yet it was enough. They fought as though they had always known how, her blade cutting close, his rifle covering distance. Together they carved a space against the tide, though the tide did not relent. Amid the fury, side lives flickered and went out. The young boy who had carried messages, face too pale to belong in war, raised a rifle he could barely hold. He fired, missed, then was struck down, his cry lost in the storm. The old tribal elder fell with prayer on his lips, his hands lifted skyward as though offering himself back to the earth. Even the bitter rancher who had scorned the talks lay sprawled in the dirt, eyes staring without blame or forgiveness. The land drank every drop of loss, silent witness to the folly of men. Through it all, the warrior did not break. Her scarred cheek was wet with sweat and dust, her arms steady though the ground trembled. She fought not for victory but for survival, for the hope that something beyond bloodshed could remain. The cowboy saw her then with new eyes, not as emissary, not as warrior, not even as woman, but as the embodiment of a truth too fierce to be silenced. His chest swelled with a resolve he had not felt in years. A moment came when escape opened like a brief crack in storm clouds. A path cut through the dust where fewer outlaws pressed, a chance to flee. The cowboy could have taken it, could have saved his skin, and left the rest to fate. But his body moved before thought could stop it. He turned back toward her, covering her flank, shouting over the gunfire that they had to move now, or be swallowed. She hesitated, eyes flaring with refusal. Yet she saw what he saw, the line thinning, the fire tightening. She nodded once, sharp as a blade's edge, and they ran. Together they broke through, the cowboy firing behind them, the warrior slashing aside the last hands that reached. Dust choked their lungs, smoke burned their eyes, but forward they pressed until the camp's chaos fell behind, and the open plains spread before them. They collapsed by the river's edge, breath ragged, blood streaking cloth and skin. His arm burned from a shallow wound, her shoulder bled slow from a cut that might scar. Yet neither spoke of pain. They sat with silence between them, silence no longer heavy, but earned. She looked at him then, eyes dark with exhaustion, yet lit by something deeper. Not gratitude, something quieter, harder to name. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of trust that had been forged not by words, but by survival. The cowboy reached out, his hand rough, his gesture uncertain. Their fingers touched briefly, a meeting of callous skin against skin, and in that touch lay more promise than any treaty signed by pen. It said, "I chose to stand with you when I did not have to." It said, "You are not alone on the path you feared." The sun had risen fully by then, its light washing the battlefield far behind them, where smoke still curled like mourning cloth. The survivors would return to Barry to rebuild, to argue again about peace and land. But for the cowboy and the warrior, the moment held stillness, the kind that follows storm. He spoke at last, voice low, raw. "I never saw it coming." Her eyes lifted to the horizon, weary yet steady. None of us did. The river moved beside them, carrying away dust, carrying away blood. In its quiet rush, the cowboy felt a truth settle deep into his bones, that trust is not given in ease, but born in fire, that peace is not written on paper, but carved into the choices two souls make when the world collapses around them. They sat until the sun climbed high, until the weight of silence became a kind of vow. The land, scarred as it was, would remember. Not the ambush, not the betrayal, not the fallen, but the fragile seed of connection planted where none thought it could grow. The cowboy rose, offering his hand to her. She took it without hesitation. Together they turned toward the uncertain road, carrying not victory, but something rarer, the beginning of belief. And as they walked, the narrator's voice folded soft as evening wind, reminding those who listened that in the dust of broken promises, trust can still rise like a stubborn flower, fragile yet unyielding, a promise the land itself would keep. If this tale stirred something in your heart, walk with us a little further, subscribe, and never miss the next story by the fire.